Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 281 of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across 4 key risk areas. Those risk areas include sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, which consists of employees and contractors. You can check out the Red Flag Group and find out more information on their website, www.redflaggroup.com. Today you are in for a real treat as I have 4 of the top compliance commentators and practitioners, product suppliers in the compliance field. We were all together at the 2017 SCCE Compliance and Ethics Institute. And so I sat down with Mike Volkov, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Armstrong, and Jay Rosen to talk about some of our reflections on the conference and then move into some greater areas of interest in the current compliance landscape. This will be a 2-part episode. In this first part, we're going to talk about the sessions we attended and the sessions that we put on at the conference, some of our observations, and what the sessions brought for the compliance practitioner. The episode comes in at around 26 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. With me, 4 of my favorite people in compliance. I have Mike Volkov, I have Matt Kelly, I have Jonathan Armstrong, and I have Jay Rosen. We are all here at the 2016 SCCE Compliance and Ethics Institute in Chicago, and since I had these great compliance practitioners here, I thought I would take the opportunity to record a podcast. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks much,
Tom. Thank you, Tom.
So, everyone here has or will give a presentation. So why don't we just go around the table and talk about what your presentation was on and what were some of the highlights, particularly what you got back from the audience. And Matt, you can just tell us about yours.
Sure. I guess I'll go first. I am speaking tomorrow at the 3rd day of the conference about enterprise risk management and how compliance professionals can help boards help them implement ERM, because I have talked with a lot of people here who all say the boards like the idea of ERM, and then the boards say, but what should we actually do about it? And start staring at the compliance officer, who then says, okay, let me walk you through it. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about how compliance officers can think of risk management, how boards do or do not think about risk management well, probably a bit more on the do not side. And then give some thoughts and observations about how they can get that program up and running and right the ship.
Are you going to be able to, or rather, are you going to try to tie some of the concepts of the COSO 2013 framework into your presentation and how it might move towards having an integrated internal control framework?
I am going to talk a bit about COSO's draft proposal for an enterprise risk management framework that is currently out for debate. Anybody who might hear this by the end of September, they are still looking for comments, so please go ahead and comment about the framework to COSO. That ERM framework has a lot of similarities to the internal control framework that was big and revamped and relaunched in 2013. And we'll talk a bit about how you can use some of your internal control experience and the muscle memory a compliance department might have there to some of the non-traditional risks that boards wind up having to grapple with, and see how they can go from there.
Hey, Matt, this is Mike Volkov. I wanted to ask you, because one of the issues I always run into on this is there seems to be a separate business side risk, sort of management, and then there's the compliance risk management.
Yeah.
And so the business risk is looking at, okay, what's the likelihood of a tornado that puts us out of business or whatever. Merging those 2 concepts together, is that what we're talking about? Or how do you bring the business side to the compliance table and compliance to the business table in that sense?
I think one thing that COSO has done with their new framework that's very sharp is that they want to replace the phrase risk tolerance. What does the board do? The board sets risk tolerance, of course, and then we all say, well, privately, we're not really sure what risk tolerance means, or it means something to everybody a little bit differently. COSO wants to replace that with accepted variability from performance goals. And essentially, I think that really connects to first line of defense business unit operators. They get what a performance goal is. They get that if this is my numbers, I can come in 5% under and I won't get fired, 10% I might, 10% over, I might get investigated. Why are things going so well? Like, they get that. That's a very good sense of it. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that a lot of boards study a risk in one way that actually will manifest in the company in a different way. My favorite, cause right now is executive compensation. If you look at Mylan Labs, what they've done with their EpiPen price gouging is not illegal. It is not a compliance failure. They were all very upfront about what they're doing. Big PR reputation risk. A compliance committee would be looking at what are our risks that the compensation might lead somebody to do fraud or take excessive risks along those lines, but not, this was a huge reputational risk that they took and they crapped out on it, and nobody's really thinking in those terms. So that's the sort of stuff I want to kind of kick around.
Mike Volkov still sporting his Sicily tan, looking very, very dapper.
No, it's the 5 pounds of pasta that I put on.
It's looking good. Didn't you speak on the Yates Memo 1 year later?
We did. It was very interesting because I did the first time I've done the advanced discussion group format, which I thought was really good. I actually enjoyed it more than doing a presentation. Limited to 50 people, and we talked about Yates and what's the impact on internal investigations. And so in the room were a cross-section of internal investigators and GCs and chief compliance officers, and from a variety of industries. And what I think I learned more than I think they learned, I hate to say it, was...
It always works that way.
It always works that way, particularly in compliance. I think I was surprised that people understood the importance of it and that they've communicated it within their organization to the highest levels, to the board, to the senior executives. Where it hasn't come back to is, okay, now what do we do? We've talked about it. And I said, and somebody raised their hand and said very frankly, all I did was get the people to read it, the board of directors to read it. And I said, but now we're at the next stage. How do we implement this? How do we react to this? And we talked about ways to sort of elevate the internal investigation practice within your company. And how do you try to, first off, and probably we had a lot of discussion about triaging cases. What's a case that starts and you start to investigate where there is a chance where you may end up having to go to the Justice Department? And if you do go to the Justice Department, what's the story you're going to tell? And are you really capable of identifying all the subjects of your investigation of individuals who could be held liable? And can you think like a prosecutor and think like conspiracy? Can think of Travel Act, think of all the ways you can make a case. And I think that's where we're at the point right now. How do we go about this? How do we react to it? Interestingly, I think somebody brought up Wells Fargo, and they said to me, the true test of Yates, everybody understands that Yates is going to lead to more increased prosecutions, but it's a pipeline. It takes time. Mm-hmm. But then we get to the issue of, let's test it. We have Volkswagen and we have Wells Fargo, and those are going to be two cases where we're going to see how high up will they go in the organization and who will they hold responsible. So everybody's sort of saying, let's watch VW and let's watch the Wells Fargo case.
Mike, did you hear Bill Baer's remarks at the keynote this morning?
I did not, unfortunately.
Well,
I was not.
He was giving remarks about what constitutes extensive cooperation, but he made clear that as a minimum threshold, even gatekeeper, you have to self-disclose first. Is that what you're seeing, or that what you heard, that people
Absolutely.
have to self-disclose before they can even get to the issue of cooperation?
Absolutely. It's got to be a voluntary self-disclosure to get in. And then the question is, so let's say you find something, you're at the preliminary stages, you know you've got to disclose it. It's so big that you've got to disclose it. It's not something that you can just keep to yourself, remediate, and move on. So you go in, you tell the Justice Department this. Now you've got a whole host of issues that come up in terms of fashioning your investigation, or even supervising outside counsel's investigation by the audit committee, or let's say by whoever, as to how you're going to handle conflicts of interest, how you're going to identify all the individuals, who's going to need separate counsel, what's the quality of the investigation going to look like. I think, for example, I was very surprised to find out that a lot of companies give upjohn warnings orally. Don't even put it in writing, and don't get a signed signature, signature from the person.
Well, you've advocated against that for years.
I've been against. And now I say with Yates, I do it.
Right.
I give each subject, not a witness, but a subject, persons whose conduct we're investigating. I give them a sheet. I read it to them, and I make sure they understand it, and then they sign it. Because ultimately what's going to happen, if these cases turn into criminal cases, defense lawyers are going to go after the internal investigation. We already saw that in the great George Washington Bridge case, where Chris Christie has still escaped prosecution, but I'm not letting out my predisposition. But
He's our resident Republican.
Chris Christie escaped prosecution, but nonetheless, that internal investigation has been subjected to incredible discovery requests and fights over notes from witness interviews taken during the internal investigation. Judges are going to start to come in and look at the internal investigation you've done. And so I think that's going to everybody's got to raise the bar of their game a little bit.
I was just thinking on a global basis. I mean, we're seeing exactly the same trends over in the UK. So we've had a major prosecution collapse, withdrawn from the jury. I mean, that's about as bad as it gets for a prosecution because of the way in which the internal investigation was conducted. So I think regulators, prosecutors are definitely alive to that. Right. And I guess a question from what you said, it seems to me that another global trend is you've got to get your house in order really quickly.
Right.
In for example, the security breach area, we've had a case in the UK just in the last couple of weeks where it seems to be suggesting that you're going to have to go to the regulator, even with a half-formed idea that you might have an issue, because the time to report is 24 hours. And for a major corporation to react to anything that quickly, I'm just not sure they're geared up, and that's maybe to your point as well.
But I don't know if you'll. There are cases that I've seen where you're not necessarily in a position to make that decision.
No.
And I think right now there's so many things that you have to do to get that information, and then even assuming you have perfect information or even close to it, the balance has changed now. In other words, we now have a little bit higher bar. And I think we're ultimately going to get to a point 3-4 years from now where coughing up individuals is going to be the surest way to reduce your fine. Right?
Yeah.
In other words, if you bring in the CEO in a case against the CEO, you'll have a great argument for taking $200 million off your fine.
But isn't the issue there that the track record of prosecuting individuals is, as an outsider, is poor in the US?
Absolutely.
There's a record of, if I was being really brutal as an outsider, there's a record of corporations surrendering. There isn't a track record of prosecutions against individuals sticking.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Yates is trying to get at. And I think what that means is that instead of providing an internal investigation that says, here's the story of what happened, here's the story of how it happened, where you didn't necessarily focus on the analysis on the elements of the case against each individual and what evidence we have, I think you're going to see a total different focus in the interaction between DOJ, probably the SEC, and outside counsel and companies bringing in these cases. Look, I agree with you. Corporations surrender. There have been cases, and I think corporations should fight more and go to trial more because FedEx obviously did quite well when they did. And we have to test some of these cases. But I do think that the balance is going to change, and I think we're going to see more individuals. And all I'm saying is that there's going to be judges that eventually start to look behind the curtain to see how did we get this evidence and was it fair to the individual? Because I'm sitting here with a guy who's looking at jail for 10 years, and before I put him in jail and you're going to use a statement against him, how did you get the statement?
Yeah.
So that was Jonathan Armstrong. Jonathan is showing our geographic diversity today. As you might have noted, he's from the eastern part of the old Americas, from England. He's with the Cordery firm. He is a compliance specialist and also a data privacy and data security expert. So a lot going on in your country.
Yeah.
Brexit, we've got the Privacy Shield. What did you talk about? What was the kind of the vibe in your session?
Well, we tried to maybe overambitiously talk about almost all of those things. So we talked about big data as the hook, and we talked about how big data is good and bad. You know, looking at an investigation point of view, how big data can help you investigate third parties you might be jumping into bed with, how it can help you investigate wrongdoing. We talked in part about the way in which prosecutors are saying that they're going to use things like artificial intelligence as well. So the Serious Fraud Office announced in its annual report that it had bought this huge machine that we're yet to see that's going to sweat data. And we talked about things like in the UK, we've got new transparency requirements, so more filings for people like oil and gas companies. And logically together, it would seem that that's the source of the data, and then this super new big machine is going to interrogate that data and guide prosecutions into different sectors based on that data.
So George Orwell lives?
Well, I wondered if it was a little bit like Catch-22. I read it a long time ago, but wasn't there this big machine in Catch-22 that could cross-reference everything to everything? And that seems to be the ambition. But then we also talked about how that is working in a consumer environment, how investigations can be challenging for the reasons we've discussed, the obtaining of evidence. Deutsche Bahn, for example, were prosecuted for the way in which they conducted an investigation disproportionately. And then we talked about things like Uber in a domestic context and how Uber's revelations that one of the things they do to assess surge pricing is battery level. So if I come out of a nightclub with a low battery, I'm going to pay more than if my phone has more juice in it. And so
I want to join that class action case.
For all the bars you come out of?
No, I don't come out of bars. It's the early bird dinners that I come out of without any juice. Okay.
So what did what were you getting in feedback from the audience? Was there a particular area of questions that you noticed?
I think a lot of people, so I presented with a last-minute substitute who I thought did a great job. So Dr. James Lynn, who's a MIT data scientist, who's been in Forbes, for example. He set up Forbes data acquisition business, so the Forbes rankings and stuff like that. And I thought we would end up disagreeing on more than we did. I think we broadly agreed that things like transparency was key, that you had to look at things like fairness. I think most of the audience did. I think they were shocked at the extent of things like the Schrems case, which is, I think really quite a fascinating case. It starts with a student doing a semester in a Californian university who thinks that the guest lecturer from a large corporation has been disrespectful to him. And net is every major multinational in the world has had to amend its data practices.
Right.
And there are many who wish that attorney had been a little more polite to Mr. Schrems, I think. And so we looked at things like consequence as well. And I think people were engaged with that. As we just said, in every aspect, the world's much more fast-moving, I think. And that's partly because of the amount of data that's swilling around, and people can do things. And, you can harness social media, you can find out what's happening like you could never before. And then we were also looking at things like, corporations tracking employees. And probably all of this sort of thing's gone on forever. I wrote an article with my daughter, who, as you know, Tom from other podcasts, has slightly strange views, but we had we wrote an article together which was fun on the Elizabethans' use of big data to suppress the Catholics in this case.
Right.
And it's not hugely dissimilar from the Snowden revelations, but they were using, in this case, handwritten notes inside beer barrels rather than, huge supercomputers that were sucking data in. So the proposition, which I think most of the audience seem to agree with, wasn't that these behaviours were new, it was the scale of it. I mean, I think there's some statistics that say 50% of the world's information, 50% of the data in the world has been created in the last 3 years, which is utterly staggering, isn't it?
One question, Jonathan, and I've heard of this new service, and they're trying to sort of push into the due diligence space. And what they do, it's a French company that apparently will, let's say we're looking at the Jay Rosen third-party due diligence, application.
Yeah.
And they will go out and scrape all of social media for anything that Jay has ever done on social media and collect it all and bring it to you as part of a due diligence report beyond all the investigative services we've had. I wonder how are they able to do that, or is that proper? And I mean, is this what we're going to get to in terms of due diligence?
I think we are, and I think there are I think there are a number of applications that do it, and I think they've been around for a few years. I spoke, not bigging myself up, with Tim Berners-Lee. So if you're not a former vice presidential candidate, you believe he invented the internet.
Right.
And maybe in, I want to say, the late 90s, when they were doing this thing called semantic search, and some kind people from a former government background offered to run my name through a computer to show me the data they had on me. One of the examples we gave in our session is, so I'm from the northeast of England. I'm from a relatively obscure town. There's a relatively obscure town less than 20 miles away. I've got a relatively unique name in the UK, certainly there aren't a lot of us. And a guy has just been charged with murder in the town next to the town where I grew up. Now, I think that's a big data accident waiting to happen. I'm pretty sure that...
With your same last name as you?
Same Christian name and last name.
Wow.
So I think that, I guess, I'm almost inclined to try it. But I guess the next time I apply for a loan or a car lease or whatever, I guess I'm going to be asked to explain the murder.
Yeah.
And
you may not ever get another job, John.
Exactly. Yeah.
or maybe you should just apply at Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that we see with all of this stuff is huge elements of data error. And the difficulty is, in my situation, for example, I might be denied X, Y, or Z, and I might never know.
Right.
And that's why I think that one of the other aspects that we looked at is the attention that privacy regulators particularly are giving this. We've had the right to be forgotten cases in Europe that are meant to give a right to people to clean that up. We've got this new law in 2018 that will bring all sorts of rights for people to see formula by which they've been denied loans, see their data, to port it somewhere else. So theoretically, in your case on due diligence, I can ask to port all of the data that you've got from the French company to a rival provider to get them to reinterpret the data. And we've got a fascinating case in the UK on that in the last few weeks with two groups of Russian oligarchs. So oligarch A is fighting oligarch B and Mrs. B, and they use, they're Russian. There's some proceedings ongoing in Cyprus. They use an investigation firm with a connection to the UK. So Mr. and Mrs. B make a subject access request under our data privacy legislation and say, we know you're investigating us, show us how far you've got in your investigation. And the investigators obviously resist. Unfortunately, they've not structured the investigation correctly. They probably haven't structured the Cypriot proceedings correctly either. And the court in the UK says, you're entitled to the data. Share the preliminary investigation report with them, because they're the subjects of the report and they've got a right to see it and they've got a right to state their case. Right. And I think when you think, one person in the audience, for example, said, but this is, Europe extending its arms into the US. Well, it is. And again, I think we've done that.
Isn't that called a global economy?
Yeah, and I think, again, we've done that for years and years, isn't it? If you look back to the Elizabethan age, Elizabeth was spying on the Spanish. It's.
I think we had a revolution over this once.
That's right.
That's how I recall. Matt, aren't you from Boston?
It does sound familiar.
So now we have Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, you gave a presentation. I couldn't tell from the description whether it was subject matter limited to your subject matter expertise of translations or if you have branched out to the broader compliance realm. So what was your talk on, and what kind of feedback did you get from the
Sure.
audience?
So I had a very alliterative title, From Bangkok to Bogota and Boston to Brussels, Global ABC and FCPA Benchmarks, Best Practices, and Boot Camps.
Did you bring your coloring book too?
Yeah, but here's the key part. One size does not fit all. So I did branch out a little bit, Tom, and I was very fortunate that I had about 60% people who were here from in-house, working for the corporations. Then I had some ringers there. I had Jonathan Armstrong, Nat Edmonds, and
Chris Robidoux.
So we had just a real engaged audience there, and one of the
Was
best
this an
parts.
advanced discussion?
Yeah, it was advanced discussion.
What did you
too.
think of the format?
I was second year I've done it. I think it's brilliant
Yeah.
because there's such a different level of people here now. How many people here?
1,700 this year.
1,700. So I think we had a little email back and forth. Some of the some of the classes or some of the sessions tend to be a little bit elementary, which is really great for the new people coming into the group. But for those who have been here, I think what really people are hungry for is that interactivity and the ability to drill down. And sometimes they don't come early, they can't do a Sunday session, or they can't do a Wednesday. So I think in this 1 hour time slot, we got a lot accomplished. And, I ended 5 minutes early, and one of the things I did was I really encouraged people to switch business cards and to use this as an opportunity to grow and have these mentor relationships.
This is Tom Fox again, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you. The first is, if you have any questions, please email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com as I am developing my next mailbag episode. The second is, if you listen to this podcast on iTunes, if you could rate us, I would greatly appreciate it. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you'll come back to listen to part 2 of my interview with Mike Volkov, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Armstrong, and Jay Rosen from the 2017 SCCE Compliance and Ethics Institute.